So, my name's Rocky. In brief, let's see here. There we go. Okay. This is me. I've been in InfoSec for a while. I work in risk, enterprise security architecture. I run a couple of red and purple teams from a pen testing perspective. I do all sorts of stuff. I do organize B-Sides Cleveland, which is coming up at the end of this month, if anybody is from that Ohio region. And my info right there, Twitter, etc. So to move on here, in 2007, this really smart guy named Gunnar Peterson wrote or co-authored a document called the Enterprise Security Blueprint, and essentially is a blueprint for enterprise security architecture. In other words, your security program. As part of your security program, the actual security program itself, comprising of process, comprising of risk management, comprising of policy and standards, et cetera, all the usual suspects. This particular actual document is very relevant today, and so as we move on, I'll kind of illustrate how it ties into how most organizations really should be looking at enterprise security architecture. A couple of eye candy images here. If you've never seen informationisbeautiful.net, that's the world's largest data breaches. Up here, the right top, that is the, in trillions of dollars, Gartner's over the past 5-6 years, global spend in information technology. It actually, for the first time this past year, has gone down. They claim that is due to the value of the American dollar. Could be. But you can also see that down at the bottom here, this is an uptick graph, which is from the Verizon DVR over the same amount of time. So what I see here is that we're spending a lot of money and probably in the wrong places. Because if we're spending all this money in IT and information security, theoretically on paper, those numbers should begin to go down. So why is this? Most organizations, in my experience, have or are looking at information security in one of two ways, and unfortunately those ways are kind of flawed. The first is from a project-by-project basis. In other words, I need to refresh my infrastructure, I need a new firewall, I need to buy the latest buzzword because the CEO read it in an industry magazine. The second way is they're looking at their security program from a compliance perspective. Now, all the old school security nerds like me are always going to say, if you're compliant, you're not secure. But if you're secure, then you're also going to be compliant to whatever compliance framework, whether that's a regulatory, federally regulated framework, or whether that's something like NIST cybersecurity and things of that nature. But the reality is this, right? The data is critical to the financial viability of your business and therefore must be treated as a function. The protection of that data must be treated as a function of the business. So enter architecture, right? Architecture is a framework that is intended to simplify the management of very complicated systems. Our organizations and businesses are very complicated systems, so therefore basing your program on security, and specifically from an architecture perspective, makes complete sense to me. Some of the benefits that you get while, that you get from implementing a security program based on architecture are things such as metrics. Metrics is very important. There was a great talk yesterday that went over a lot of different types of metrics, but at the end of the day, metrics, that's how we, probably most of you in here on the technical or security side of the house, that's how we communicate back up into the business. The business, they're not technical people, right? But they need to understand where the budget needs to be focused on. They need to know what the priorities are. And so through architecture, we have the ability to communicate those priorities back into the business. So, architecture, here we go. Today, I'm going to be talking about threat management, but this is really kind of the, the intro to the talk. Architecture. This model, again, from 2007, which is completely relevant today, takes your enterprise security architecture and shows that we have three primary pillars: risk management, policy and standards, and then actual design architecture itself. Those three pillars are supported in some way, shape, or form by process, our typical controls, which are considered defense in depth, right? Your endpoint security, your network security, et cetera. And then metrics, like I just mentioned. Within the process side of the house, this is where I've been focusing quite a bit over the last few years with a number of our clients. Last year, I did a very similar talk, but on enterprise class vulnerability management like a boss. This year, I've been spending a lot of time working with organizations from a SOC monitoring perspective, an IR perspective. So this year, I'm doing threat management like a boss. So let's figure this out. The threat management process itself is typically broken down into these types of controls and processes, et cetera. Threat modeling, incident response, the buzzword threat intelligence. Does anybody know who Norse is? Raise your hand. Does anybody know whether today they're bankrupt? They don't exist anymore. That was a very interesting example of threat intelligence that got a lot of funding but didn't have any content. So what are our challenges here? Okay, so if we start with the basics, we have Moore's law, right? So malware is evolving at an equal speed. Moore's law, every 18 months, our processing power doubles. Okay, so we have that to deal with. The intelligence issue, we have to know about trends. We have to know about actors. We have to know about incentive and motivation. Okay, I'll get into this in a little while, but that's threat modeling. Okay, so there are different ways that we can go about actually modeling who might be motivated enough and incentivized enough to steal something from you, right? And threat modeling. Communication. Obviously, we need to be able to communicate all this within the business, right? Who needs to be involved at what point, et cetera. The communication between inter-processes, right? Vulnerability management and threat management are completely different areas. But the vuln side of the house needs to be able to communicate data over to the threat side of the house the same, and vice versa. So communication is exceptionally important here. That then goes hand in hand with coordination and accountability. You have to have some level of accountability at every step and every level of these types of processes. We have incident response that may span multiple business units within your organization, right? Who's accountable for each one of those areas? And because of that accountability, they have to have already bought in on the incident response process itself. So, more importantly, there was a report in 2012, I'm going to read this here. Here's the big issue here, right? We have all of these fantastic next generation firewalls and intrusion detection and endpoint controls that are throwing gobs and gobs and gobs of information at us, right? So it's, from a threat management side of the house, it's our responsibility to analyze that and be able to assess an appropriate course of action based on the input, right? So what are then going to be our outcomes? This Sensage 2012 report showed that the massive and mostly manual effort of collecting and analyzing security data has caused a severe downturn in the mood of security teams, as well as the perception of their effectiveness by stakeholders. That's a problem. That's such a problem that report no longer exists on the internet. It's a dead link. So, I was actually too lazy to go to the web archive to find the link. But we have to keep this, this has to be, bearing in mind as we move through all this, because if any of you have seen the things that I've seen, right, if you've seen the things I've seen, etc., from all of, the vectors, the actors, right, the response, the lack of accountability, this is what we need to, the point here is to develop a maturity exercise, right? So the way I'm going to talk about this is, I'm going to actually just skip this, right? We know we have goals, right? So what I want to actually really dive into here is anybody familiar with the Application Security Verification Standard? It's an OWASP framework for application development. Anyone? A couple people? Okay. OWASP, the 2014 version, and they're now at version 3 of that 2014 documentation or framework. What this is a real-world way to manage and determine the maturity of your software development lifecycle and application development process. Okay. It is an implementable framework, whereas the OWASP top 20, here are all the things that you need to be doing and whatnot, was fairly unimplementable in my opinion, just as a techie even, right? So it breaks things down into 4 levels, but the first level is level 0, meaning I don't care, I don't want to talk about it. That means you're not really doing anything of interest. So levels 1, 2, and 3 of the ASVS essentially breaks things down very, very simply. And they even put it out as an open source Excel spreadsheet. Okay? So now you can basically say, okay, section for authentication. Are these types of controls in place? Are they? Okay, then if not, then collectively you are going to fall into level 1, level 2, or level 3. Level 1 being, okay, you probably need a bunch of work. Level 2 is typically a great goal for most verticals, unless you are in critical infrastructure or anything that affects human life, okay? That's really now where level 3 needs to be, your organization needs to move towards level 3. So the intent here, and again, this is software development lifecycle, or AppDev, but the intent here is to, as opposed to the standard compliance question, are you performing vulnerability scans? By going through this type of maturity exercise, the question then is, and you will be able to answer it, how mature is your vulnerability management process? How mature is your threat management process? In this case, how mature is your software development lifecycle? So what I've done over the past, again, couple years, last year I did vulnerability management, this year threat management, is, from an improvement perspective, taken this framework, this level 1, level 2, level 3 framework for the ASVS, and applied it to threat management. So I'm going to run through some of the things that I feel it makes sense to exist in each of those 3 levels for threat management. And then I actually put some stuff out on GitHub that I would love everybody to then take a look at and contribute, and merge back into the actual, the repo. But it is essentially a threat management and a vulnerability management, but I'm not going to cover that one here, but they both live in the same repo. A threat management maturity framework. All right, so here we go. Level 1, threat management applied to the ASVS framework. Opportunistic, okay? This indicates that the organization can adequately defend itself against non-targeted threats that are easy to discover, okay? Typically discovered with minimal to low effort. And so when we take a look at what should be a requirement for at least achieving level 1, I've come up with this, right? There's no dedicated InfoSec or risk group. There's a reliance on rudimentary alerts, firewalls, network IPS, antivirus, etc. There is a process in place for handling malware-infected systems. right? And that's typically some type of refresh, refresh the system that might be infected, et cetera. There is centralized logging, but no correlation. The sporadic, quote, threat intelligence is coming from very basic things like Network World or maybe even a SANS email subscription. There might be some open source vulnerability scanning tool that is assisting in and assisting providing data into the threat management process itself. And the organization then is comfortable with essentially regulatory compliance. In other words, the idea that being compliant to whatever framework, that's good enough to secure our business critical data. So, level 1, right? Level 2, this is the standard, again, that most organizations are, should be looking at, which indicates that the organization can adequately defend itself against prevalent threats of moderate to serious capability, which could include hacktivism and non-targeted organized crime actors. The majority of business organizations, again, should work towards this level. And this is what I think that looks like. And again, this is why I have put this up on GitHub, because I want a community, essentially I want community input from this. This is what I think for level 2 threat management applied to the ASVS framework. There is now a dedicated InfoSec/risk group, including a dedicated monitoring resource. Integration with existing level 2 vulnerability management, right? So again, I'm applying the ASVS to vulnerability management. A similar level vulnerability management process should exist as well. Basic monitoring framework and SIM deployment, documented incident response frameworks, red penetration/purple team testing. Does everybody understand the concept of purple team testing? A couple people, I'll explain it. Red teams are the attackers, blue teams are the defenders. The purple team is really the hybrid penetration test, where the attackers are sitting side by side with the defenders and stepping through kill chains, basically, stepping through attack chains, right? We're going to do this, then we're going to do this, 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 and this. Did you detect this? Did you detect that? Did you detect this, right? And so collectively, the collaborative nature of that purple team hybrid test, in our experience, has provided organizations a lot more value than just saying, okay, go attack, break in, and see what those guys are doing, see if they detected anything. InfoSec risk group may utilize enterprise ticketing system for documenting incidents. Now we're starting to get into coordination, collaboration, communication, right? So some type of content management system that is tracking, enterprise incidents. Open source/internal/commercial threat intelligence. I don't really care either way. If you're doing it yourself internally, if you have some type of subscription to whatever threat intelligence might be out there, and at any level, right? So you have the IP lists, which are whatever, and then up to things like Talos, if you're familiar with some of the Cisco, how Cisco is really sharing a lot of the threat information that they have, because their footprint is so gigantic. It actually is very interesting. Further, there's a defined standard for reviewing this type of intelligence with escalation processes. Commercial/open source tools are used for centralized logging and or SIM, right? So now we actually have the centralized logging with the, just blanked on the word, with, not collaboration. The SIM is taking correlation. Thank you. I kept on thinking collaboration. So now we actually have something that is doing correlation of events, right? Asset and data classification standards which are based on business critical systems within the organization. Okay, data classification is one of the most critical things that a business should be doing when looking at the maturity of your enterprise security architecture. Right? You have to understand what the business critical data is. Where do you think it lives? Who should have access to that? Now we start getting into identity management, which is another process within the enterprise security architecture. But that has to be defined and agreed upon, from top down. And so now with that criticality kind of defined and in place, we can begin looking at threat severity and then prioritization. Prioritization of events that could mean that we have an incident. Threat modeling standard should be in place. Whatever that threat modeling standard is, and I'll go over a couple, three, but whatever threat modeling standard you like, that should be, that should be in place and used to understand things like what are the actors and what capabilities are the people that might find my data valuable. Advanced endpoint controls. If anybody does pen testing, I don't remember the last time that I've actually executed anything on disk, right? Which means everything is going into memory via PowerShell or however, not touching disk, and therefore bypassing all antivirus, bypassing all application whitelisting, okay? The trending of how advanced actors are actually getting into systems needs to be part of your intelligence. And if the intelligence says that we're not even touching disk and bypassing all, there's a need now for an advanced level of endpoint control that, whatever that might be, but is looking at different things, right? Microsoft has Emmet, which is free, the Enhanced Mitigation Experience Toolkit. Be careful with it. It's still a little interesting in an Active Directory enterprise. But hey, you know something? That's free, and it's looking at things like behavioral anomalies. What does a buffer overflow actually look like? It's not looking at did this code that just executed on my machine match a signature. It's looking at more things. There's a couple examples here, right? Corporate cloud adoption standards. We have to, obviously we have to take into consideration everything that is happening in the cloud at this point. But we need these types of standards to meet this level 2 criteria. Third-party risk assessments, right? Are your third parties basically complying with your standards or what you feel your business should be requiring from, in terms of two-factor authentication, in terms of password, management, et cetera. So that it's that third-party risk assessment is necessary as well. Encryption is pretty important as well. And so when we take a look at now this level 2 model of maturity in relation to threat management, I think that that's fairly reasonable. I think that all those things are fairly reasonable for most organizations to begin working towards, right? And again, nobody has unlimited budget. This is 1, 2, 3 year, type planning strategically to begin moving towards a mature level 2 threat management process. So now what does level 3 look like? Now level 3 obviously is going to require quite a bit more time, energy, motivation, etc. But from a high level perspective, this is what it looks like. An organization can adequately defend itself against all advanced threats and shows principles of good security design, requires a mature enterprise security architecture. If we go back to that, the enterprise security architecture model that I laid out, this is very appropriate for critical applications that protect life, critical infrastructure, and or defense, right? So when we take a look at these requirements, we've already stepped through level 2. So level 2 exists. Now, threat prioritization standards, right? So there should be some type of threat prioritization standard that takes into consideration, from event to incident, who needs to be alerted, who needs to be involved, who's accountable, RVAsec, right? So the RVAsec charts should be right there, right? So mature IR framework includes buy-in, et cetera. But understanding, okay, now what level of incident from a priority perspective can the help desk deal with? And what level of incident from a priority perspective needs to be escalated to the SOC, right? Because at this point, we have a dedicated SOC based on level 2, and now, what do those responsibilities look like? IR tabletop exercises, and these can include things like domain breach that then, as part of the actual incident response process, forces the responding teams to go to out-of-band communications, right? These types of exercises. Phishing the high-value target, whether that's the CEO, whether that's the executive assistant, who is actually typically much more fun and interesting to go after because of her access or their access. Ransomware, simulating actual ransomware, simulating the malicious insiders. Internal incident response, content management system is in production. All threat investigative activity is documented, right? We have things like IR honeypots. Does anybody know what DCEPT is? DCEPT is a very interesting tool that Dell SecureWorks just released a couple months ago, I think. One of the ways that the malicious actor and teams like ours get into and are able to move laterally through an organization once we, let's say, phish a target is through a process called, basically we're scraping memory credentials, we're scraping login credentials either in clear text or the actual hashes, the password hashes from the LSS memory process. There's a program called Mimikatz that does this, and it does it very well. So DCEPT, right there, is really, really interesting. It's basically honey hashes. So if you know conceptually what a honeypot is, right, we have a system that is on purpose has vulnerabilities, and we're monitoring for all of those types of ways to exploit those vulnerabilities. DCEPT is honey hashing. So basically, it's throwing up into the LSS process fake hashes, fake password hashes. So now your SOC team that's monitoring for all of these things can be monitoring for the usage of fake password hashes. If that shows up, boom, that we know exactly ground zero from the start of a potential incident that could then begin moving laterally through your organization. Kanza is a I want to say PowerShell. Is it PowerShell? Yeah, I think it's a PowerShell framework. Again, open source stuff. GR is the GR. Google. It's a project by Google. Yeah, rapid response. Thank you. Again, this is all open source stuff, and these things are intended to help the IR teams and the SOC teams pull artifacts, right? So what's running in memory, right? What are the processes that are running on these systems that we have reports that somebody clicked on something that they probably shouldn't have, right? So by getting all of this type of data into the SOC and then the IR teams, now we again are building towards threat prioritization, right? We have more data that we can look at and make these important decisions. Process creation auditing is also very important. Enforceable identity access controls. The last few here at level 3, network identity access controls. Things like, should these systems, should an unauthorized system be able to connect either wired or wirelessly to our network? And if not, then being able to prevent them from actually getting an IP address, right? We were working with an organization who had a big 4 accounting firm come in and do a red team penetration test. We were on the defensive blue side. We were looking for things like PowerShell execution because, for those of you who don't know, Microsoft created the greatest hacking tool ever in PowerShell. So we were looking for PowerShell execution. We were not made aware that the red team was actually starting, that the engagement was starting. We saw that, and within under an hour, we were able to utilize the network identity access control systems to isolate that system and just knock them off the network in under an hour. So they didn't like that. And so we actually had to let them back onto the network to finish their finish all these tests because they were very expensive. And the clients that I was working with didn't necessarily think that all that money should be used for just an hour. Documented threat multipliers. I'll show you an example of threat multipliers in a second. Adversary capabilities assessments, right? Return on investment. I think the last time I was here at RVAsec a couple of years ago, I mentioned Josh Corman. I'm going to mention him again. Free plug for Corman. Corman is, he's talked about on many occasions the concept of adversary return on investment. But the gist is, right, data theft is a giant business. Every business has a budget. So by understanding who is going to be incentivized to steal your data and what their capabilities are, we can begin developing a model around calculating some level of return on investment for the adversary, right? It's going to take them, they have a budget to steal your data, so it's going to take them time, money, energy to try to break into your systems, escalate, move laterally, find what they want that is valuable to them, and exfiltrate it out. So understanding the actual threat, adversary, return on investment, their capabilities is a critical part of threat management itself. Periodic threat matrix exercises, and your reports as well, but metrics. So let's talk about metrics. Metrics from a threat management perspective, we look at things like incident metrics, right? So incident the characteristics, target system characteristics, the timelines. From an attack metrics perspective, the vectors, the attack sophistication, attack profile characteristics, obfuscation techniques. Data metrics, right? So what data has been targeted? What data has been compromised itself? What data has actually been exfiltrated? Incidents by status. Again, here's now where we're getting into enterprise ticketing systems, right? So the maturity level at level 3 should have your IR teams working, within the confines of the enterprise ticketing system, right? So now by looking at the status of tickets, we can really begin to track and generate future metrics for the business. And then some of my favorites here, mean time to compromise. What's the cost to disrupt, right, an attack? What is the adversary means or capabilities like I talked about? And again, adversary return on investment. So that kind of in a nutshell at a high level is what I think level 3 threat management applied to the ASVS framework should look like. I want to talk a little bit about threat modeling. I'm not going to say I'm not going to stand here and preach one versus another, but I want to just make sure that I'm communicating that there are a number of different threat modeling frameworks out there. This is the 3 tenets model. There is also the diamond model of intrusion analysis, which is an excellent, excellent paper. If you are, within your organization, on the threat management side of the house. One of my favorites is Bruce Potter did a talk at DerbyCon a couple years ago called Threat Modeling for Reals. And within that, this is so simple. I love it, right? So here's a threat model. Actor does action to asset, resulting in outcome because of motivation. That's beautiful. That's a beautiful, simplified version of threat modeling. Some additional important things, documentation. This is Lenny Zeltzer's Cyber Threat Intelligence Incident Response Report. It's actually about 12 pages long, but it breaks everything down beautifully from a documentation perspective. What are the, and again, all these metrics that I've been talking about, right? So the capabilities of the actor, what are they targeting, et cetera. But it's just a fantastic template for documenting your incident response, your incidents. Lexicon is also very important. Varus is an open source project that is really intended to create a common lexicon about incident data right? So event recording, VERIS is the vocabulary for event recording, and incident sharing is a set of metrics designed to provide a common language for describing security incidents in a structured and repeatable manner. Again, that's GitHub, right? All this is great, you know, all this is free. The last couple things here, let's see if I can actually do this. I have demo in quotes here, because it's not really a demo, it's an Excel spreadsheet. But I'm going to try to do this anyway, so bear with me if this doesn't work. Wait for it. See? Hey! At least I can get an Excel spreadsheet to work for a demo. Okay, so this is very, very simple. Oh, let me start with this, right? Over here on this other tab, this is the first tab. This is the actual official ASVS spreadsheet, right? So it's broken down into different subsections. So, you know, section 2, and we have all of these types of things that, depending on what level, depending on the result of your organization, right, you'll then fall into these levels, right? And obviously, level 3 has every one of these as part of it, right? So that's the ASVS. Here's my version for threat management, right? So if we take a look at the organization, I'm not going to go through all these, right? But again, I think the next slide is my GitHub site, so you can go check it out and hopefully contribute. That'd be great. But taking a look at things from an organizational perspective, verifying data classification standards exist, right? Verifying user/group to critical services standard exists. That's important because threat priority, right? Ensuring that we have an understanding of if a user is being targeted, what their role and therefore criticality to the business actually is, that's going to affect our threat prioritization, right? So again, I broke it down into organization, controls, monitoring, actual incident response, and then documentation and metrics. The other thing that I will show you here is, this is just a sample of one of our threat prioritization spreadsheets, right? So we're starting with, okay, we've got this type of input from these types of systems as well as user reports. You know, in this case, the SIM is QRadar. So if we can start playing around with things like, okay, well, we've just discovered that we have a remote access tool in the environment, and actually we have 20 to 50 of them. You can see that over here, we're based on the criteria that we had for this particular example, for this particular business. We now know that based on that, we need to escalate. The Corp ID portion of this, though, is this is what I was just talking about in terms of, we use PowerShell to get the AD principal group membership and figure out what groups that person is a member of, and based on that data, now we can begin mapping those groups to the critical services within the business itself, and now we have a prioritization from a user perspective, right? So now, if, let's just say that it's not a remote access tool, but it's something maybe like just a standard virus, and it's only affecting, a couple of people, but one of those people happens to be in a group that is a critical role to one of the actual organization's critical business units, that's going to, the calculation is going to escalate that up to, now we have to go into the, pump that up into the SOC. When we bump it up into the SOC, now we can see that we have some threat multipliers, right? And in this case, we also use a tool called ThreatGrid, which you can take a sample of malware, either an actual link or an actual either Word document or executable, and submit it into this cloud service. They blow it up. They figure out all the network. They explode all the processes, figure out the networks that it's communicating back to, basically everything from a profile perspective you would want from dissecting a piece of malware, but they do it in the sandbox in the cloud, and they give you this report. Now you have everything you need to begin searching for that within the organization. Here are the registry entries that particular malware edited or added or deleted. Now let's go search for it throughout the organization. Threat multipliers, though, are things that in many times we may not know from a response perspective. Right, so origin. Well, we might not know that at first, but if there comes a point where we do begin, to have that understanding, threat multiplier, right? What is the intent, right? Steal money, destroy assets, hurt reputation. But at the end of the day, here's, if you kind of look down in here at rating, description, response, and whatnot, if we give this a different, rating from an actual scoring perspective, a prioritization perspective, these things, who do we have to notify? The CISO, et cetera, depending on the priority of the actual event itself. Okay, let me get back to this. Right here, right here. Go. Come on. There we go. So continue laughing, because that's awesome. All right, so the last couple things here. This is a very simple little repo, right? So those the threat management Excel spreadsheet that I just gave you, or I just showed you, that's here, as well as from last year the vulnerability management framework as well. So I would love it if people, if you're interested, feel free to download. The CSV is easiest to kind of, and I'm not a Git master or anything like that, but the CSV versions are actually easier from my perspective to use and commit back in, just because it's not an Excel binary. And then I'll handle it from there. But at the end of the day, what's next? I think that if we take a look at on the process side of the house, back to the enterprise security architecture model, right? ASVS is this maturity exercise right there for SDLC. I just did threat management. I just covered threat management, and I've covered vulnerability management, and I think it just makes sense. What's next for me is probably going to be working on a similar maturity framework for identity management. That's pretty much it. Here is a number of the references. There's the architect paper, ASVS, right? So I'll make these slides available. I think it would be awesome for the community to help kind of build this maturity model, these maturity exercises. But with that, thank you.